What's the most unbelievable thing someone's accused you of doing? I was 8 months pregnant and handcuffed to a hospital bed while law enforcement officers pressed me to admit I was selling my unborn baby. 2 weeks earlier at my baby shower in Charlotte, North Carolina, my husband David and I announced the name would be Connor James. Connor after my grandfather James after David's brother who died in Afghanistan. My sister-in-law Rebecca got this weird look instantly. She pulled me aside pressing, "Where did you get that name? How did you know about Connor James?" I explained the meaning, showed her the framed photos of my grandfather and David's brother. But she kept asking, "But how did you know?" She left without touching the cake. That night she blocked us on everything. We figured she was just having personal issues, but then I woke to pounding on our door at 5 a.m. 2 weeks later, 2 officers with weapons drawn. That's how I found out Rebecca had reported us to the Crimes Against Children unit. She claimed we were trafficking our baby using a stolen identity, that she had proof of our plans to sell our child to the highest bidder. They separated us immediately. David was dragged out in handcuffs while I screamed. Before I knew it, I was at Charlotte Memorial Hospital for the baby's protection, handcuffed to the bed like I was already convicted. Detective Richard sat in my room, gun visible. "We know everything," he said, slamming down a folder. "Connor James Murphy, 6 years old, Michigan. Your sister-in-law documented your obsession with this child." "I don't know any child." "Shut up." He showed me Facebook screenshots. "These marketplace posts? Selling duplicate packages? That's code for twin babies. These buyers you mentioned? We know what that means." My blood pressure monitor started alarming as he kept reading out things that were our baby purchases. The nurse rushed in. "She's at 180 over 120. This stress could cause—" "She's faking." Detective Richards interrupted her. "They all do this." Officer Martinez arrived with CPS workers. "Your baby will be removed at birth. You'll never see it. That's if you're lucky and don't get life without parole. Please, Rebecca is lying." "Those were registry gifts. Your husband's already confessed," Martinez said. Trying to save himself. "Said it was all your idea." My stomach suddenly seized. Sharp stabbing pain. Something's wrong with the baby. Convenient timing. Richard scoffed. "Sit still." The pain intensified. I felt warm liquid. "I'm bleeding. Please." "You're not bleeding. Stop moving or we'll add resisting arrest to the charges." The nurse checked anyway and gasped. "She's hemorrhaging. Get Dr. Blake now. She's faking." "She's having a placental abruption." The nurse hit the emergency button. "This is life-threatening." Richards grabbed the nurse's arm. "How much did she pay you to say that?" Dr. Blake ran in, saw the blood, and went white. "Jesus Christ, how long has she been bleeding? 5 minutes? Maybe 10? They wouldn't let me." The nurse started, or immediately. We could lose them both. But Detective Richards blocked the door. "She's in custody. She stays here. Then you're signing their death certificates." Dr. Blake snapped. "This is a medical emergency. Let me call my supervisor," Richards said slowly, pulling out his phone while I writhed in agony. "There's no time," Dr. Blake shouted. "She's losing too much blood." "Protocol is protocol," Richards said, dialing. The call went to voicemail. He started leaving a detailed message. My vision was going dark. The nurse was pumping fluids into my IV while another nurse ran in with blood bags, her pressures dropping. Someone shouted. "Still waiting for authorization," Richards said. Now texting his supervisor. "Hospital policy says custody transfers to medical authority during emergency surgery," the head nurse said, pulling up regulations on her tablet. Page 47. Section 3. Richard started reading through the policy while I screamed through another contraction. Blood was pooling on the bed now. "This looks fake," he said about the policy. "Could be edited." "It's from the federal website," Dr. Blake roared. They finally started wheeling me down the hall. Officers jogging alongside. Richards kept saying to Martinez, "Watch for her to run." "They sometimes have accomplices dressed as medical staff. She's hemorrhaging," Dr. Blake shouted. "She can't run anywhere. In pre-op I was barely conscious. The anesthesiologist saw my handcuffs." "Absolutely not. These come off for surgery. She's a flight risk." "She's 8 months pregnant, bleeding out, about to be unconscious." "Where would she go?" He looked at my chart. "You've had her blood pressure at stroke levels for how long? Are you trying to kill her?" Richards insisted on keeping one officer in the OR. "I need visual confirmation she doesn't escape." The anesthesiologist called security. "I need hospital administration here now. We have federal officers interfering with emergency medical treatment." The hospital administrator arrived, looked at the situation, me pale, bleeding, barely conscious, and told the officers, "You can stand outside the OR or I'm calling the Office of Professional Responsibility and reporting attempted murder by denying medical care." Richards pointed at me. If she wakes up, we're charging her with everything." The baby goes straight to CPS. No contact. Everything went black after that. I woke up feeling like my whole body was on fire, especially my stomach area where they'd cut me open. The recovery room lights were too bright and everything felt fuzzy and wrong. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw from the breathing tube. A nurse appeared beside me and checked my vitals while I struggled to form the one word that mattered. Baby. She looked at me with this mix of relief and sadness that made my heart stop. He's alive, she said quietly. But he's in the NICU and very small. I immediately tried to sit up to go see him, but she gently pressed me back down. The movement sent sharp pain through my incision, and I gasped. She explained that I couldn't visit him because CPS had taken custody, and there was a no-contact order in place. The words didn't make sense at first. My baby was alive, but I couldn't see him or hold him or even know how he was doing. The nurse leaned closer while adjusting my IV and whispered that she documented everything that happened in the OR. She told me the officers had delayed my care for almost 20 minutes while I was bleeding out. She slipped a small piece of paper under my blanket with her personal phone number written on it. If you need someone to testify about what they did, she said, I'll be there because it was criminal. She quickly moved away when footsteps approached. A CPS worker walked in carrying a thick folder and wearing this fake smile that made my skin crawl. She introduced herself and started pulling out forms, saying they were just routine paperwork about the baby's care. I asked what the paper said, but she kept deflecting, saying it was standard procedure and I needed to sign them right away. Something felt wrong, so I told her I wouldn't sign anything without a lawyer. Her whole face changed, and she got this nasty look. She said refusing to cooperate would be documented and used against me in court to show I didn't care about my baby's well-being. She left the papers on my bedside table and stormed out. Hours passed in a blur of pain medication and vital checks. Then I heard familiar footsteps in the hallway, and David appeared in the doorway. His left eye was swollen shut and purple, and his right wrist was in a brace. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the time we'd been apart. He rushed to my bedside and we just held each other and cried. Through his tears, he told me they'd finally released him on bail after his brother posted the money. He swore over and over that he never confessed to anything, that Officer Martinez had lied about that. He said they'd beaten him in the interrogation room when he wouldn't admit to trafficking our baby. We were still holding each other when a different officer walked in and announced he was there to enforce the no-contact order. David looked confused and said the order was just about the baby, not between us. The officer said the order covered all parties involved and David had to leave immediately, or he'd be arrested again for violation. David kissed my forehead and whispered that he loved me before the officer escorted him out. I was alone again. The hospital social worker came by later and found me sobbing into my pillow. She sat down and explained that I qualified for legal aid since we couldn't afford a private attorney now that David had been suspended from work pending the investigation. She helped me call from the hospital phone since mine had been confiscated as evidence. The legal aid lawyer on the phone sounded young and overwhelmed, but she promised to file an emergency motion for NICU visitation rights. She said it might take a few days to get a hearing. 2 days later, they discharged me, even though I could barely walk from the C-section pain. A nurse wheeled me to the hospital entrance where David's brother was waiting to drive me home since David couldn't come near me. The drive home was silent except for my occasional gasps when we hit bumps that sent pain through my incision. Walking into our house in the Dilworth neighborhood felt like entering a tomb. Everything was exactly as we'd left it that morning the officers came, except now it felt empty and wrong. The nursery door was open and I could see the crib we'd assembled just weeks ago. The tiny clothes hanging in the closet, the rocking chair where I'd planned to nurse him. I couldn't go in that room. I physically couldn't make myself cross that threshold. I closed the door and haven't opened it since. The next morning, I woke up to my chest feeling like it was going to explode. My milk had come in with no baby to feed. The pain was unbearable, both physical and emotional. I stood in the shower letting hot water run over me while I manually expressed milk that just went down the drain. I sobbed so hard I threw up, then had to hold my incision because the heaving hurt so bad. I wondered what Rebecca really thought she discovered that made her so certain about this supposed trafficking scheme. The way she kept pressing about, "How did you know at the baby shower?" suggests she'd convinced herself of something specific. But Richard's showing those Facebook Marketplace posts. This became my routine every few hours, crying in the shower while my body produced food for a baby I couldn't feed. 3 days after discharge, my lawyer called to say the emergency hearing would happen over video because I was still too weak to travel to the Mecklenburg County Courthouse. I sat at my kitchen table in front of my laptop, trying not to cry as the judge reviewed the case. The prosecutor argued I was a flight risk and a danger to the child. My lawyer pointed out that I'd nearly died giving birth and had no criminal record. After 20 minutes of back and forth, the judge ruled I could have 1 hour of supervised NICU visitation daily, but the no-contact order with David would remain. He said the investigation was ongoing and these were temporary measures for the child's safety. The next morning, I took 3 buses to get to Charlotte Memorial Hospital since I couldn't drive yet from the surgery. At the NICU entrance, a CPS worker was waiting with a security guard. They searched my bag, patted me down, and made me empty my pockets. The CPS worker followed me into the NICU and stood right behind me the whole time. When the nurse brought me to his incubator, I couldn't breathe. Connor was so tiny, maybe 4 pounds, with tubes and wires attached everywhere. His skin was almost translucent, and I could see his little chest working so hard to breathe. The nurse said I could hold him and carefully placed him on my chest. He was so light I was terrified I'd break him if I moved wrong. The CPS worker stood there watching every move I made, writing notes on her clipboard about how I held him, how I looked at him, whether I seemed bonded. But none of that mattered in that moment because my baby was in my arms for the first time, and he was alive. The NICU nurse waited until the CPS worker stepped out to take a phone call, before leaning close to whisper that Connor had been crying nonstop since birth. She said he wouldn't eat right for anyone, and the other nurses were worried. But the second I held him, he went completely quiet and his breathing steadied out. She made sure to write all of this in his chart while the CPS worker was still outside. That same afternoon, David's mom called the hospital room phone since I wasn't allowed my cell. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She kept saying she was sorry about Rebecca and that they didn't know what to do. Then she told me something that made my whole body go cold. Rebecca had a miscarriage 4 years ago at 5 months, and she'd already picked the name Connor James for that baby. She'd had the nursery done and everything before she lost him. My mother-in-law said Rebecca never got help for it and just pretended it never happened. Now suddenly Rebecca's reaction at the baby shower made sense. When she heard us say Connor James, something broke in her mind. She thought we'd somehow stolen her dead baby's name on purpose. The grief she never dealt with turned into this crazy idea that we were selling her baby. Not ours. I tried to tell the CPS worker, but she said it didn't matter what Rebecca's problems were. 3 days later, our lawyer filed papers asking the judge to drop everything based on Rebecca's mental health history. She had records from Carolinas Medical Center about the miscarriage and even found Rebecca's old social media posts about baby Connor James from 4 years ago. But the prosecutor said no way. He said they had to check everything out no matter what because kids were involved. Then the bills started coming. First one was $18,000 for the emergency surgery. Next was $12,000 for the NICU so far. Insurance sent a letter saying they wouldn't pay because of the criminal investigation. They said if we were found guilty of trafficking, they didn't have to cover anything. David couldn't work because of the charges, so we had no money coming in. Every day, more bills showed up and the total kept climbing. Meanwhile, I heard from our lawyer that Detective Richards got put on desk duty while they looked into what happened during my emergency. But Officer Martinez got promoted to sergeant for his work on our case. The nurse who saved my life by documenting everything suddenly had her hours cut from full-time to 2 days a week. The hospital said it was just budget cuts, but everyone knew better. A week later, we got a letter from a lawyer saying Rebecca wanted grandparent rights to Connor. The letter said she had a right to see her nephew and that keeping him from her was cruel. She still thought he was connected to her lost baby somehow. Our lawyer said it was insane, but we'd have to fight it in court, which meant more money we didn't have. During my next visit, I was holding Connor when his monitor started going crazy. He'd stopped breathing and was turning blue. The CPS worker just stood there frozen with her mouth open. I flipped him over and started infant CPR like they'd taught us in the prenatal class. 5 back blows, then flip and check. Nothing. 5 more back blows. The CPS worker still hadn't moved or called for help. I kept going while his lips got darker. Finally, on the 3rd round, he coughed and started crying. The nurse ran in and took him to check him over. The CPS worker wrote in her report that I was aggressive with the baby and didn't follow supervision rules. She said I grabbed him without permission and did unnecessary medical procedures. Because of that report, they cut my visits to 30 minutes and said 2 supervisors had to watch me now. 1 week later, David texted me from a number I didn't know. He said he'd borrowed a co-worker's phone and asked if I could meet him at the Harris Teeter parking lot on Park Road. We both knew it was against the no-contact order, but I didn't care anymore. I needed to see him. We sat in his car for maybe 5 minutes just holding each other and crying. He looked terrible, lost maybe 20 pounds and had dark circles under his eyes. He kept saying he was sorry he couldn't protect us. I told him about Connor stopping breathing and how they were punishing me for saving him. Neither of us saw our neighbor pull up next to us until she was taking pictures through the window. She'd already called the police to report that we were violating the order. David drove off fast while I ran to my car. The police showed up at our house an hour later, but David wasn't there, so they couldn't arrest him again. 2 days later, our lawyer called with news that made my hands shake so bad I almost dropped the phone. She'd been digging into Detective Richards' background and found 6 previous complaints for excessive force and false arrest, all buried by the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department with no disciplinary action taken. She was filing a motion to get them admitted as evidence, showing a pattern of misconduct that could help our case. The next morning, I was at my 30-minute visit with Connor when I heard screaming in the hallway outside the NICU. Rebecca's voice cut through the glass doors, yelling that I stole her baby and demanding to see him right now. The CPS supervisor jumped up and ran out while I held Connor tighter, watching through the window as Rebecca pushed past two nurses trying to get to the NICU doors. Security guards came running from both directions while other parents in the waiting area grabbed their kids and backed away from Rebecca, who was now pounding on the locked NICU entrance. Connor started having trouble breathing in my arms, his monitors beeping as his oxygen levels dropped, and the nurse had to take him from me to adjust his breathing tube while Rebecca kept screaming outside. They finally dragged her away, but not before 3 other families saw the whole thing, and one mom was crying, holding her premature twins closer. The stress was destroying my body too. My milk supply started dropping, no matter how much I pumped or how much water I drank or what supplements I took. The NICU nurses had to start giving Connor formula to supplement what little I could produce, and the CPS worker wrote it all down in her notebook, documenting that I was failing to provide adequate nutrition for my son. 3 weeks after his traumatic birth, Connor developed a heart murmur that got worse every day until the cardiologist said he needed immediate surgery to repair a defect that was likely caused by the stress of the emergency delivery. They let me sit in the surgical waiting room, but I couldn't sign the consent forms because CPS had legal custody, so I had to watch a social worker I'd never met before sign permission for them to cut open my baby's chest. The surgery took 4 hours, and I spent every minute pacing the waiting room, checking the board that showed he was still in the OR, drinking coffee that tasted like dirt, and watching other parents get good news while I waited. The surgeon finally came out looking exhausted and told me Connor had survived, but his heart had stopped twice on the operating table, and they'd had to work to bring him back both times. My legs gave out, and I hit the floor hard, waking up in a hospital bed with an IV in my arm and a doctor explaining I'd been admitted for severe dehydration and exhaustion because I hadn't been eating or sleeping properly for weeks. While I was still admitted, a nurse friend texted me that hospital security had caught Rebecca in the parking garage wearing scrubs she'd stolen from somewhere, trying to sneak into the NICU through the employee entrance. They arrested her for trespassing and attempted unauthorized entry. But when the case went to the prosecutor's office, they declined to press charges, saying Rebecca needed mental health treatment, not jail time. Our lawyer was furious when she called me about it, especially after what she'd just discovered about our case. She'd gotten access to the original police report through discovery and found that someone had altered it after Rebecca's initial complaint, adding details about supposed code words and trafficking connections that weren't in the original version. Rebecca wearing stolen scrubs to sneak into the NICU takes dress for the job you want to a whole new level of wrong, though clearly she's already mastered the art of making up stories. The timestamp metadata on the electronic file proved Detective Richards had gone back and changed the report 3 days after my emergency surgery, falsifying official documents to make their case look stronger. She was preparing criminal charges against Richards himself when the prosecutor called with an offer. They wanted me to plead guilty to misdemeanor child endangerment, accept 2 years of probation, and in exchange, they'd drop all other charges, and I could regain custody of Connor in 6 months. Our lawyer said it was extortion, that they knew their case was falling apart and wanted to save face, but she also said it might be the fastest way to get Connor back. I told them no immediately because taking that deal meant admitting we'd done something wrong when we'd done nothing but choose a name for our baby. David disagreed when I told him about it that night, calling from his friend's phone since we still couldn't have direct contact. He wanted to take the deal just to end this nightmare and get our son home, saying 6 months was better than the years this could drag on if we kept fighting. We ended up screaming at each other through the phone, our first real fight since this whole thing started, him saying I was being stubborn and me saying he was giving up. The next morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and a woman's voice said she was a reporter who'd gotten a tip from someone at Charlotte Memorial about our case. She wanted to hear our side of the story for an article she was writing about CPS overreach and police misconduct. I told her I couldn't comment on ongoing legal proceedings and hung up, but 3 days later the story ran anyway with the headline, "Local couple accused of selling unborn baby," plastered across the front page of the Charlotte Observer website. The comments under the article were worse than the headline itself. People posted our address, our phone numbers, even pictures of our house in Dilworth they'd taken that morning. My phone started ringing nonstop with blocked numbers, leaving messages about what they'd do to baby sellers like us. One man described in detail how he'd make us pay for trafficking innocent children. Another woman left 10 voicemails crying about how we didn't deserve to live after selling babies. I changed my number that afternoon, but somehow they got the new one within hours. David's phone was getting the same treatment at his friend's place where he was staying. We both had to get new numbers 3 times that week before finally getting unlisted ones. 4 days after the article ran, I woke up to banging on the front door at dawn. I looked through the peephole and saw nobody there, but when I opened the door, red paint was dripping down from huge letters sprayed across our garage. Baby killers covered the entire door in letters 3 feet tall. The paint was still wet and running down onto the driveway. I called the CMPD to report it, but the officer who showed up just shrugged and said, unless I had video of who did it, there was nothing they could do. He didn't even take photos or file a report, just told me to buy security cameras and left. I spent the whole morning trying to scrub it off, but the paint had already dried into the wood. The neighbors stood in their yards watching me scrub, whispering to each other, nobody offering to help. 2 weeks later, we had our first real court hearing about Connor's medical condition. The NICU doctor took the stand and went through Connor's medical records page by page. He showed the judge how Connor had suffered brain bleeding from oxygen loss during the delayed delivery. He explained how the 43-minute delay, while Richards argued about custody, directly caused Connor to code twice during surgery. He stated clearly that if I'd gotten to surgery when Dr. Blake first ordered it, Connor would have been born healthy. The prosecutor objected constantly, saying the doctor was speculating, but the medical records showed everything. The timestamps proved Richards kept me bleeding in that bed for almost an hour while my baby suffocated inside me. The doctor said Connor would need years of therapy for his developmental delays, all because 2 cops thought I was faking a medical emergency. 3 days after that testimony, our lawyer called with news that made me throw my phone across the room. Detective Richards had suddenly retired with full pension and benefits, effective immediately. The internal investigation into his conduct during my emergency was automatically closed since he was no longer an employee. The CMPD spokesperson said they don't investigate former officers, so Richards would face no consequences for nearly killing us. He'd get his full retirement pay for the rest of his life while my baby struggled with brain damage he caused. Our lawyer filed complaints with the state board, but they said the same thing about not having jurisdiction over retired officers. Meanwhile, CPS sent us a thick packet of requirements we had to complete before they'd even consider reunification. We had to take parenting classes every Tuesday and Thursday evening for 12 weeks at a center in Cornelius, 40 miles away. We had to submit to random drug tests at our own expense, even though nobody had ever accused us of drug use. We had to complete full psychological evaluations by their approved providers, who charged $800 each and didn't take insurance. We had to have our home inspected monthly by CPS workers who would show up whenever they wanted. The total cost came to over $6,000 just for the evaluations and classes, not counting gas and time off work. We had maybe $300 in savings after paying the lawyer's retainer. I stared at my grandmother's jewelry box for 2 days before I finally drove to the gold buyer on South Boulevard. Her wedding ring set that she wore for 60 years went for $400. The pearl necklace my grandfather gave her for their anniversary got me $200. The antique brooch from her mother brought $300 more. I sold every piece except one thin gold chain, using the money to pay for our required evaluations. The psychologist spent 3 hours with me, asking about my childhood, my marriage, my pregnancy, everything, except what Richards did to us. Her report said I had severe PTSD from the traumatic birth and forced separation from my baby, but that I posed no danger to children. CPS took that same report and twisted it, telling the judge my PTSD made me too unstable to parent safely. They said I needed extensive therapy before I could care for a baby, ignoring that they caused the trauma in the first place. David's evaluation went worse because he broke down crying when talking about Connor, which they documented as emotional instability. The same week, David's boss at Bank of America called him into a meeting with HR present. They'd seen the Charlotte Observer article and decided the criminal charges violated their company's morality clause, even though we hadn't been convicted of anything. They gave him 15 minutes to clean out his desk while security watched. No severance, no unemployment eligibility, just immediate termination after 5 years of perfect reviews. We were now living on just my disability payments from complications after the traumatic birth, barely enough to cover rent on our Dilworth house. 2 months after that nightmare in the hospital, Connor was finally stable enough to leave the NICU. But instead of coming home to his nursery, CPS placed him with a foster family in Huntersville, 20 miles away. The foster mother seemed nice enough and sent us photos through the caseworker showing Connor in clean clothes, in a nice crib, being held and fed properly. Seeing those pictures of strangers caring for my baby destroyed me worse than anything else. We were allowed exactly 2 supervised visits per week at the Mecklenburg County Department of Social Services building uptown. Each visit lasted 1 hour in a small room with cameras and a CPS worker watching every move. Connor had been with the foster family for 3 weeks by our first visit, and he didn't know us anymore. When I picked him up, he screamed and reached back for the caseworker he saw every day. The worker wrote in her notes that we failed to bond with the child and that he showed signs of distress in our presence. She didn't write that any baby would cry being handed to strangers in a cold government building. By the fourth visit, Connor would calm down after about 20 minutes, but the damage was done in their documentation. Rebecca's family tried to help by staging an intervention at her house in Myers Park, but she locked herself in her bedroom and called the police on them. Her sister told me later that Rebecca kept insisting we were criminals who stole her dead baby's identity for trafficking purposes. She had notebooks full of evidence she'd collected about us, including photos of our house she'd taken for months before reporting us. Her husband couldn't take it anymore and filed for divorce and emergency custody of their 2 living children. Rebecca responded by accusing him of being part of our trafficking ring, saying he was covering for us because we'd threatened him. The divorce judge ordered her to undergo psychiatric evaluation, but she refused to go. Our lawyer spent weeks going through financial records for the prosecutor's office and found something that made her actually gasp on the phone. The private foster care agency getting paid to house Connor had contracts worth millions with the county. 3 board members of that agency had donated the maximum amount to the prosecutor's re-election campaign. The prosecutor's brother-in-law was a paid consultant for the same agency. Our lawyer filed a conflict of interest motion demanding a special prosecutor, but we knew it would take months to get a hearing on it. 3 weeks passed before the judge even looked at our motion. And when he did, he called it frivolous. He wouldn't remove the prosecutor, but agreed to have someone review the case files independently. Richard's retiring with full benefits right after that damaging testimony seems awfully convenient timing. Makes me curious if someone higher up suggested he take that golden parachute before things got messier for the department. The reviewer spent 2 days looking at everything and wrote in his report that he found significant problems with how evidence was collected and documented. He listed 17 different violations of procedure, including Richard's changing the police report after Rebecca's complaint and the prosecutor hiding evidence that helped us. But then he wrote that despite these issues, the prosecution could continue because the violations weren't bad enough to stop the case completely. Our lawyer slammed the report on her desk so hard her coffee spilled everywhere. The stress was destroying me from the inside out. I couldn't sleep more than 2 hours at a time, and when I did sleep, I had nightmares about Connor crying for me while strangers held him. Food tasted like cardboard, and I lost 20 pounds in 3 weeks, even though I was supposed to be recovering from major surgery. My milk had dried up completely from not being able to nurse him. One morning I woke up and couldn't remember what day it was, or why David wasn't in our bed. I thought he was an intruder and started screaming until he turned on the lights and I saw his face clearly. Then I remembered everything and broke down sobbing, but the confusion kept happening. I'd forget where I was, or think I was still pregnant, or believe Connor was in his crib down the hall. David found me standing in the nursery at 3 a.m, rocking an empty blanket and singing to it. That scared him enough to drive me straight to Presbyterian Hospital, where they admitted me to the psychiatric ward for evaluation. The psychiatrist diagnosed me with postpartum psychosis, brought on by the forced separation from my baby, combined with the trauma of nearly dying. She said it was actually amazing I hadn't broken down sooner given everything that happened. I stayed for a week, getting medication adjusted and learning coping strategies, but CPS found out immediately. They filed papers saying my mental breakdown proved I was an unfit mother who couldn't safely care for a child. They wanted to terminate our parental rights completely, based on me getting help for a condition they caused. When the hearing happened, my psychiatrist testified for 2 hours, explaining that the psychosis was a direct result of being forcibly separated from my newborn, while recovering from traumatic surgery. She showed brain scans and hormone tests, proving the separation disrupted my normal postpartum bonding process. She said with proper treatment and reunification with Connor, I'd recover completely within weeks, but CPS brought their own expert who never examined me and only read the intake notes. He testified that any mother who developed psychosis was dangerous to children regardless of the cause. He said I could snap at any moment and hurt Connor even if I seemed fine. The judge said he needed time to review both expert opinions, which meant another month of waiting. During that time, something shifted in the case because suddenly, after 4 months of supervised visits in government buildings, CPS approved unsupervised visits in our home twice a week for 4 hours each time. Connor was almost 4 months old and didn't know us at all. The first home visit, he screamed when the caseworker left and wouldn't stop crying for an hour. But slowly, over the next few visits, he started recognizing my voice and would calm down when I sang the songs I used to sing while pregnant. I documented everything with photos and videos showing him smiling at us, reaching for my face, falling asleep in my arms. David installed cameras in every room to record our visits, proving we were good parents. We turned his nursery into the happiest place possible with mobiles and toys and soft music always playing. By the 6th home visit, Connor would light up when he saw us walk in and reach his little arms out to be held. The second one was to say, we were great parents long term. Then Rebecca violated the restraining order we'd gotten against her. She sent 3 letters to our house over 2 days, each one more disturbing than the last. The The first one said she forgave us for stealing her dead baby's soul and using it for evil purposes. The second explained how Connor James was actually her miscarried baby reincarnated, and we'd trapped his spirit in the wrong body. The third had pages of religious verses about theft and damnation, with our names written in what looked like blood, but turned out to be red marker. Her husband brought us the originals himself, apologizing over and over. He said Rebecca was getting worse and had built a shrine to her lost baby with our son's pictures she'd stolen from social media before we blocked her. He tried to get her committed, but she kept passing the basic mental health evaluations by acting normal for short periods. Our lawyer added the letters to our evidence file and filed another motion to dismiss, based on the accuser's obvious mental illness. The prosecutor responded by offering us a deal for the first time. They'd drop all charges if we agreed never to sue the police department, CPS, or any government agency involved in the case. Our lawyer said it meant they knew they'd lose at trial, but wanted to avoid paying damages. The criminal trial got scheduled for 2 months away, and our lawyer started preparing witnesses. She said we had a strong case, but warned that juries get emotional about anything involving babies and might convict us just because we were accused. I couldn't handle the waiting and uncertainty anymore, so I started writing about what happened to us online. I posted our story in a Charlotte parenting group explaining everything from Rebecca's breakdown at the baby shower to Richard's nearly letting me die to Connor being taken away. Within 3 days, the post had 50,000 shares and hundreds of people messaging me with similar stories about CPS taking their kids based on false reports. A reporter from WBTV contacted me wanting to do a story, but our lawyer said to wait until after the trial. The support from strangers kept me sane when everything else was falling apart. People sent money for legal fees and offered to protest outside the Mecklenburg County Courthouse and shared advice about fighting CPS. Some had won their cases and got their kids back, while others had lost everything. The prosecutor must have seen the online attention because he called our lawyer with a better offer. All charges dropped immediately if we signed papers saying we wouldn't sue anyone involved and wouldn't talk to media about the case. Our lawyer explained this was them admitting they knew they'd lose, but trying to avoid liability for the harm they caused. She recommended refusing and going after them for everything they did to us. We refused the deal and filed a federal civil rights lawsuit the next day against the CMPD, Detective Richards personally, CPS, and 3 individual caseworkers. We asked for $10 million in damages for the illegal arrest, denial of medical care, forced separation from our newborn, and ongoing harassment. The city attorney filed to dismiss our lawsuit within hours, claiming government immunity protected everyone involved. Our lawyer said she expected that and had prepared a response showing immunity didn't apply when officials knowingly violated constitutional rights. Then everything changed when a NICU nurse named Angela Thompson contacted our lawyer. She'd been fired 2 weeks after Connor was born for insubordination, but really it was for supporting us. She had recordings on her phone from the emergency when Richards delayed my surgery. She'd started recording when she realized he was letting me bleed out and caught him, saying to Martinez that he knew the trafficking charges were bullshit, but they had to follow through since they'd already arrested us. He said once they started the process, they couldn't back down without looking stupid and opening themselves up to lawsuits. The recording was crystal clear and included him laughing about how we'd never see our baby grow up. Our lawyer played the recording for the prosecutor the next morning in his office, while I sat there watching his face go from confident to pale to completely defeated. He kept stopping the recording and replaying parts, especially the section where Richards laughed about us never seeing our baby grow up and admitted he knew the trafficking charges were fake from the start. The prosecutor's hands were shaking as he picked up his phone and called the state attorney general's office to report police misconduct and evidence tampering. Within 2 hours, federal agents showed up at the CMPD station and arrested Richards right at his desk in front of everyone. Martinez saw them taking Richards away in handcuffs and immediately asked for a deal through his union lawyer. He came to the prosecutor's office that afternoon and spent 3 hours giving a sworn statement about how Richards pressured him to go along with a false arrest. Even though they both knew Rebecca's report made no sense, Martinez admitted Richards had altered the police report after the fact to add details that weren't in Rebecca's original complaint, and that Richards had threatened to ruin Martinez's career if he didn't back up the story. The prosecutor dropped all charges against us that same day with prejudice, which meant they could never charge us again for anything related to this case. The judge signed the order immediately and added a scathing comment about prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption that would become part of the permanent court record. He ordered CPS to return Connor immediately, but the caseworker said they needed 30 days to process the paperwork and conduct home visits and background checks, even though we'd already passed everything months ago. Our lawyer filed an emergency motion right there in the courthouse, and the judge called CPS leadership into his chambers for what the bailiff later told us was the loudest screaming match he'd ever heard through those thick doors. Talk about your classic domino effect. One nurse with a phone recording just brought down an entire corrupt system faster than Richards could say, qualified immunity. The judge came out and signed an order demanding Connor be returned to us by 8 p.m. that night, or he'd hold the entire CPS department in contempt and start jailing supervisors. The foster mom brought Connor to our house at 7:45 p.m. with 2 garbage bags of his clothes and toys and a folder of medical records from his 5 months in foster care. She was crying as she handed him to me, saying she'd grown to love him but always knew he belonged with his real parents, and she was sorry for everything we'd been through. Connor was 5 months old and had no idea who we were, turning his face away when I tried to kiss him, and reaching back toward the foster mom when she headed for the door. I spent that whole first night just sitting in his nursery holding him while he slept, afraid if I put him down he'd disappear again, feeling his weight in my arms and smelling his hair and trying to memorize every detail of his face. David sat on the floor next to the rocking chair with his hand on my knee, both of us crying silently while Connor slept between us, finally home but feeling like strangers to our own son. 3 days later, at 2 a.m., we woke to pounding on the front door and looked out to see Rebecca trying to break in with a crowbar, screaming that we'd stolen her baby and she was taking him back. David called 911 while I grabbed Connor from his crib and locked us in the bathroom, listening to Rebecca smashing windows and screaming about how Connor James was her dead baby and we had no right to use it. The CMPD found her in our backyard trying to climb through the nursery window, covered in blood from the broken glass, still screaming about her baby even as they put her in handcuffs. They took her to Charlotte Behavioral Health Center for involuntary commitment after the officers saw the complete break from reality, and her husband called us the next morning sobbing and apologizing and begging us not to press charges. He explained Rebecca had lost a pregnancy years ago at 6 months and had chosen the name Connor James for that baby, and seeing us use the same name had triggered a complete psychotic break where she believed we'd somehow stolen her actual baby. He brought their 3 kids over that afternoon to meet their cousin, and for 20 minutes in our living room, it felt like a real family as the kids played with Connor and asked if they could babysit when he got bigger. We agreed not to press charges if Rebecca stayed in treatment and took her medication, and her husband promised to make sure she never contacted us again when she was stable enough to understand what she'd done. The civil lawsuit settled 2 weeks later for $1.2 million, enough to pay off the medical bills and our debts and set up a college fund for Connor, though the city admitted no wrongdoing and sealed all the records. Richards lost his pension and faced criminal trial for false imprisonment, evidence tampering, and violation of civil rights under color of law, which could mean up to 20 years in federal prison. David and I started couples therapy because the trauma had nearly destroyed us, with him blaming himself for not protecting us better and me unable to forgive him for being arrested and leaving me alone even though it wasn't his fault. The therapist helped us understand we'd both been victims and neither of us could have prevented what happened, and slowly we learned to trust each other again instead of constantly waiting for the next disaster. Connor started catching up on his milestones quickly once he was home, rolling over and sitting up and babbling constantly, though he still didn't recognize us as his parents for weeks. Then one morning when I went to get him from his crib, he reached up his arms and said, "Mama, clear as day," and I sat on his bedroom floor crying for an hour while he played with his toys and kept saying it over and over. Richards got convicted 8 months later and the judge sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison, which wasn't nearly enough for what he did, but seeing him in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit gave us some peace. Charlotte Memorial Hospital invited us to a ceremony where they announced new policies about police interference and medical care, calling it Connor's Law, requiring officers to defer to medical staff during emergencies and making it a felony to delay life-saving treatment. A year later, we set up Connor's high chair in our backyard with a small cake, while David grilled burgers for the few family members who still talk to us. The mailman handed me a card with Charlotte Behavioral Health Center's return address, and inside, Rebecca had written 3 words in shaky handwriting. "I'm so sorry." The first real apology we'd gotten from her. Connor smeared blue frosting all over his face, while David's cousin took photos and his mom helped clean up the mess, everyone pretending the past year hadn't happened. 2 weeks after the party, David came home carrying a box from his old desk because a tech startup owner who'd followed our case online had offered him a senior position with full benefits and flexible hours. He started the next Monday, and his first paycheck covered our entire month's expenses, plus extra to start paying down the legal debt that had crushed us. The NICU nurse who'd saved that recording called to tell us she'd gotten her whistleblower settlement check for $80,000 and had already enrolled in nursing school to become a patient advocate. She sent us updates every few weeks about her classes and how our case inspired her professors to add new curriculum about standing up to law enforcement overreach. The North Carolina legislature contacted our lawyer about testifying at hearings for 3 different bills they were drafting based on what happened to us. We drove 4 hours to Raleigh, and I sat at a long table with a microphone while senators asked questions about Richards delaying my surgery and CPS taking Connor without evidence. The bills passed 2 months later, requiring police to defer to medical staff during emergencies, mandatory recording of all custody removals, and immediate judicial review of emergency separations. Rebecca's husband brought us a thick envelope 6 months into her treatment with a 10-page letter she'd written during therapy sessions. She explained how losing her pregnancy had broken something in her mind, and seeing us use the name Connor James had made her believe we'd literally stolen her dead baby's soul. She wrote that she understood she'd never meet Connor and accepted that as consequence for what she'd done, but wanted us to know she was taking her medication and working to get better. Another year passed and I was pregnant again. This time with a girl we decided to name Hope, and the delivery happened at the same Charlotte Memorial Hospital but felt completely different. No handcuffs, no officers, no threats. Just David holding my hand while the nurses, some of the same ones from before, celebrated with us when Hope arrived healthy and screaming. We brought her home 2 days later to meet Connor, who was now walking everywhere and getting into everything, and he kept trying to share his goldfish crackers with her. He'd point at her and say baby over and over, then run to get his toys to show her even though she was too little to play yet. The pediatrician said he was hitting all his milestones perfectly with no signs of the trauma from his first 5 months, which felt like a miracle considering everything. We still jumped when someone knocked on the door too hard, and David still checked the locks 3 times before bed, and I still had nightmares about Richards's face, but we had our family together under one roof with no supervised visits or caseworkers or court dates, just normal problems like Connor refusing to eat vegetables and Hope keeping us up all night. Our marriage counselor said we'd made incredible progress learning to trust again after the system had tried to destroy us using our love against us. David's job was going well, and we'd paid off half the legal debt and even started a small savings account for the kids' college funds. Connor would never remember those horrible months in foster care or the NICU where he'd cried for parents who couldn't come, but we'd remember for him. We kept every document, every photo, every piece of evidence in a box in our closet because someday he'd be old enough to know his story. For now, though, he was just a happy toddler who loved his baby sister and his toy trucks and had no idea his name had almost cost us everything. You know what haunts me most? It wasn't the handcuffs or the bleeding or even losing Connor for 5 months. It was how quickly everyone turned on us. Our neighbors, David's coworkers, people who'd known us for years. All it took was one news article with the word trafficking and suddenly we were monsters. The system that's supposed to protect children nearly killed mine. Detective Richards is out of prison now, probably collecting his pension checks while Connor still goes to therapy for his developmental delays. The foster care agency that profited off our separation is still operating, still taking kids from families, still getting paid by the county. But here's what they didn't count on. We didn't break. They tried to destroy us using our love for our son against us, and instead we became stronger. Connor's law has already saved 3 other families from what we went through. Rebecca's case led to mandatory mental health screenings before CPS investigations. The recording that saved us inspired nurses across the country to document police interference in medical care. Sometimes I look at Connor playing with Hope and think about the parallel universe where that night never happened, where we brought him home from the hospital like normal parents, where his first months were filled with love instead of strangers. But then I realized something. In that universe, Detective Richards would still be out there. Other families would still be going through this nightmare. Other babies would still be suffering. Our pain had a purpose. Our story matters. And if you're going through something impossible right now, if the system is failing you, if everyone's turned against you, remember this. The truth has a way of surfacing. Justice might be slow, but it's not blind. Connor James Thompson, named for love, born through trauma, raised in truth. He's 3 now, and every morning when he runs into our room yelling, "Mama, Daddy," I'm reminded that some things are worth fighting the whole world for. Rebecca still sends letters sometimes. She's stable now, on medication, living in a group home. Her last letter had just 4 words. I broke your family. But she's wrong about that too. She tried to break us. Instead, she made us unbreakable. Thanks for listening to our story. If it helps even one person stand up to corruption, if it saves even one family from this nightmare, then every sleepless night was worth it. Hit that like button if you believe families deserve better. And remember, never let anyone convince you that loving your child makes you a criminal.